Good morning from Delhi and good evening to American and Canadian and other friends from that part of the world. So I welcome you all in this webinar on unlocking the secrets of research, a guide to reproducibility and effective data management. My name is Nabi Hasan. I am head librarian at Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, and also 2024 president of the engineering community. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the speakers, Sarah and Heather, for sparing their valuable time and agreeing to deliver this webinar together during this odd hour. It is very odd for them, close to 11 p.m. there. I am also thankful to my colleague, Dr. Manu TR, for facilitating this webinar. We got a great response as far as the registrations are concerned. In fact, it reached close to 800. But due to being in odd hours for North America, many could not join and requested to share the video recording. So we will be sharing the video with all of you after the session is over. And for those who do not know, the Special Library Association or SLA is a 116-year-old professional organization of library information professionals providing great professional services. If you are not a member of the SLA, please consider becoming the member through the SLA website. For Indians, it is subsidized just $50 per annum, and it offers great professional opportunities, and also there are many awards that you can apply for, and I'm luckily a recipient of many of those awards, including Engineering Librarian of the Year, Bonnie Hilditch, SLA Fellow, etc. Uh, so like there will be 20 minutes each presentation by Sarah and Heather. Then we will be taking up the Q&A after the session is over. And you can post the questions in between in Q&A part. This session is of total 1 hour duration. And those who may be interested in getting a digital certificate, we will be providing them the certificate as well. So I would like to introduce now Sarah for the first presentation. Sarah Siddiqui is the Reproducibility Librarian at the University of Rochester River Campus Libraries. I think she will first explain what is this designation is, because it is special for us. As a member of the library's data services, she manages platforms such as lab archives and recommends tools and best practices for sharing methods, workflows, and code across disciplines. Sarah has an MS in data science from the University of Rochester, an MS in information science from the University at Albany, and a Bachelor of Business Administration from our own Delhi, Indraprasth University, Delhi. And one thing I would like to share that my boss has both the degrees from your university, University of Rochester, Professor Ashwini Agrawal. So thank you, Sarah, for your agreeing to our request, and over to you. Thank you.
All right, so good morning or good evening, everyone. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Sounds. All right, you see my slides? Great.
Yes, yes.
Perfect. Thank you. So thank you for the introduction, Nabi, and thank you, SLA, for inviting us for this webinar, and thank you all for joining. Like you said, if you have any questions at any point, please let us know, or let us know if you want us to slow down as well. I think my introduction did cover a lot about my position and what I do, but I'll talk about reproducibility, and hopefully that helps you also know what we do in our work. And also, I'm joined today with my colleague, Heather Owen, who is our data librarian with me at our University of Rochester's River Campus Libraries. So I'll just start by going over our plan for today. Just a broad outline is we'll first start by talking about the importance of reproducibility and what that entails. Next, we will talk about the various elements of a reproducible work. After that, Heather will be talking about data reproducibility, what that includes. And finally, we will wrap up by talking about a recommended workflow. So I'm going to dive into why we bother with reproducibility and what that means. So this is a really fun video. It has a lot of music. I like to mention that at first, and it talks about a non-reproducible workflow and what issues that has. So I'm going to play now, and hopefully you can all hear it. All right. So that was very loud, and hopefully that woke everyone up. I know it woke my roommate up. But here, this video is a really great example of having a reproducible workflow with GitHub, and R was the example that they showed over here. And the idea essentially is that when you do something, it makes it easier to make changes in your code. You don't have to go in and manually type in everything and make changes. It allows you to smoothly transition into things and saves time for you. And it's especially important for collaborative work. And that's the idea of reproducibility, that as you do your work, it's work that can be built upon by others because you're sharing all of the components. And then when we talk about the importance, we also like to tie this into the FAIR principles. So the FAIR principles of data sharing, you might have heard about that. They talk about your works being findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So reproducibility does tie into all of these factors in different ways. But the two areas that it is especially relevant to, I think, are interoperability and reusability. So interoperability, the idea is, again, the work is not something that only works on your machine. It works on different software, or even if it's a particular software, you share all of the requirements, so it works for others. And reusability. So again, that's sort of the idea that people can build upon it and continue to iterate and improve over it. So it's important and it's useful, and this leads into the growing requirements around this. There are a lot of journals and funders that are requiring different things relating to reproducibility. So this started pretty early on. In 2014, the journal PLOS had started with the basic requirements for having mandates with data availability statements, and these are progressively increasing. So in 2022, Nature came up with their reporting standards, where they said that a condition in Nature portfolio is that authors are required to make materials, data, code, and all associated protocols promptly available. So this was it's a shift where all things are included. It's not just the manuscript. And then Springer requirements, Nature is also coming up with requirements for a DOI for the works. So again, something that can find your works with something persistent as well. So some of these, a lot of times people associate reproducibility with the sciences. But the fact is, actually, some of the requirements started off with the social sciences back in 2014. And just in that vein, the journal Sociological Sciences has a reproducibility policy since last year, where they require depositing replication packages and or sharing a pre-registration as applicable for their works. So I'll talk about pre-registrations in a bit. And again, with other disciplines, so MDAR, which works with material sciences, they have a framework, which is a checklist for different things that they want authors to factor in when they're sharing their works. So these were the journals that we think about, and there are a lot of funding agencies that have mandates. So in the United States, the National Institutes of Health, or the NIH, is way ahead of the game with their requirements and the things that they want people to do. But we have seen in the last couple of years, all other funders here as well, like the National Science Foundation follow suit. So here I have a link, and we will be sharing the slides with you. But the UK Research Council has a list of different funding bodies across the world that have different requirements around reproducibility and sharing works. So next, let's dive into the elements for a reproducible work. So I briefly mentioned registrations or pre-registrations right now, just now. The basic idea around pre-registration is that before our researchers even get into the data collection phase of a project, they can register the methodology or the hypothesis. OSF registries is one of the well-known ways of doing this, and they can get peer-reviewed for this and sort of get an early claim, and then they can do the data collection and sort of tie that into what they had done early on. So another thing that is growing, especially in the social sciences, are registered reports, where they also allow for peer review of methodologies and the protocols before even the data collection. So again, the idea is for increasing the credibility of the works that the researchers are sharing. So we talk about sharing their works. So pre-registrations come early on, and then we also like to talk about preprints. So I'm sure you all must have heard about Archive for sharing preprints before the journals are published. And these are a great way for boosting visibility and discoverability. OSF preprints are also another way people can share their preprints. They also aggregate a lot of preprint servers, so it makes it easier to find those the works. And we're all familiar with the journal publication process. So sometimes when authors submit their articles, it can take a long time for the works to be available. So preprints are a great opportunity to get feedback early on. And again, it ties into allowing people to build on the results. So what we recommend for researchers is that when they share their preprints, in addition to that, they also share the code and software, just because there have been studies that show that there is a positive correlation between the availability of code and software and the number of citations. So some of the components that could be included in your works, so these, depending on the disciplines that people are working in, may vary, so they may have one or more. With regards to methods, so especially if people are working in the biological sciences, they can publish those with protocols.io. And there are growing requirements around persistent identifiers. So we looked at DOIs early on. When they talk about identifiers for people, ORCID is a very well-known one. And in the United States, there is another memo that came out 2 years ago that says that going forward, any work that is federally funded would require for all the people associated with that grant to have a persistent identifier. And basically that's saying that ORCID is going to be required going forward. There are also some interesting conversations happening around persistent identifiers for instruments. So I've added a link to this FAIR facilities or workshop that took place early this year. And there they were talking about having an identifier even for different equipment that could be used in research. So this is happening in different places. This workshop talks about the work being done in the US, but there was a speaker over there talking about some work being done in Australia as well. Next, if people are working with experiments, an electronic laboratory notebook is a really useful way to share those and collaborate with people. Lab archives is one example. If people are working with projects, again, OSF has tools for different components that people can share. If people are doing programming or doing coding, then sharing their codes via GitHub is also very useful. And I'll have an example for that in a minute. I also wanted to mention CodeOcean. So I've seen examples of journal articles where they have an embedded environment where people can see the code and run that. And it sort of has the entire environment that people use. Makes it very interactive as well. And the other thing that's really important is to maintain documentation and have a consistent file naming convention. So Heather is going to talk about file naming conventions in a bit. But with documentation, we also recommend creating a data management plan or a data management and sharing plan, depending on the funder. And it's also important to think about licenses. And here we like to emphasize that licenses can be different for different components. So for instance, if people are publishing an article, there might be certain licenses that the publisher allows, but if you're sharing your code, it could be shared in a different platform, and you can have a different license for that. And similarly for other pieces, things on protocols.io are generally CC BY. So just something to highlight and keep in mind. And then there are other requirements about trainings for responsible conduct of research, again, happening in the US as well. So next, I wanted to talk about some tips that people can use for making their codes reproducible. I have a link to a notebook over here that I'm going to show you right now. So it just takes you to this page. Do you see my browser? Thank you, Heather. I just wanted to say as well, so I'm talking over some coding tips, but you do not need to know programming to know these tips. It's really something very general that people can use regardless of a programming language. But the example I have over here is a program in R, which is in a .ipynb file. So that's a Python notebook or a Jupyter notebook. And it's just uploaded here. And it has some of the tips that you could use. So one thing that we always recommend researchers do is use meaningful variable names, because as people are coding or programming, they will be creating variables. And just X and Y is not going to make sense. And here's another thing that we always say. Every programming language I know has a way of including comments in there. And I like to tell my students too that comments are your best friends, because I know that when I write a programming language, if I go back to it 2 months later, I will forget what I was thinking. So just to keep track of things and why you're including different pieces. And typically you would be including things like different libraries and different packages. So this is good to keep track of that as well. Now, here's an example of a command in R called session info. This tells you about the different versions of the packages and the dependencies you have loaded. Most languages have something of this sort. And this is really useful. So when I uploaded this file, this was a few years ago, this was using R version 3.6.1. We're now on R 4.2, or maybe even ahead of that. And it talks about the different libraries and what versions we have over here. So it's possible that maybe if you download this notebook or something similar, there might be things that have changed in 4.2. There might be compatibility that is not working. And this helps people to keep track of things, and maybe they can revert things if needed. Next, so we talked about having variable names that are meaningful. And here's a good example of why. So here I have a graph that's just an X and Y plot. So you will look at this and you'll be like, what does this mean? This could mean anything, right? These are just a bunch of points. But here I renamed my plot with meaningful variable names. So here you can see clearly that this is a plot of top speed against stopping distance from the car's data. So again, that just makes more sense. So just some good practices that people can use. So when you're sharing your works and with your code and different packages, normally people would have things in a folder that they can share with their articles, etc. So one thing in the code that is helpful to do is to use a relative file path and not absolute. So here I have an example where, say, this worked on my friend's computer very well, but now if I try to run this on my machine, this is not going to work because this is giving the full file path for her computer. Instead of that, I had everything in this folder called reproducibility and a file called output. If I run this, this is going to work on everybody's computer. Next, when people are processing data, another thing to keep in mind is you're going to make changes to your data. You're going to modify it, which is of course natural, but you want to ensure that the original data that you had stays intact and you're not making any changes to that. So make a copy of let that stay as it is, and then you can make copies and download that data separately. So here's an example of what I had done over here, where I split my data, made some changes to one of the columns, and then I just saved those files separately so I can keep track of things. Also using functions is really helpful Because again, the idea with programming is that you want to use function, you don't want to repeat the same thing. And it also helps to go back and make changes. And then finally, setting a seed is another helpful tip because a lot of times people may need to generate random numbers in their code if they're programming. So seeds are a good way of keeping track of what numbers were generated, because if you run this command every time, the numbers change. So just something to keep track of. So I'm going to go back to my slides in the interest of time. So just some of the tips that we talked about are mentioned over here. And the packages that we install. We talked about some of these programming tips already. Another thing I like to highlight is that have code that produces output. So when people are programming, there's going to be a lot of trial and error that they do. Sometimes you may not end up using this, some piece of the code as part of the final output. So you can get rid of that. That is generally a better idea because you want things that are meaningful and useful. So code produces output. That's the basic idea. We talked about seed values as well. I wanted to talk a bit more about version control. So as you make changes, and that's another power of GitHub, because you want to be able to track changes for what you have been doing at what time. It allows you to revert back as well. There are also times and functionalities may change with new versions, as we were talking about earlier. So here are some things that you could use. In R, there are some packages like Backrad and Checkpoint and Docker that also help you to keep track of the versions. We looked at the session info command. Other languages also have similar options. So Python has Conda that helps to keep track of things. And then there's also containerization. So CodeOcean, as we had mentioned earlier as well, the idea with containerization is that it saves everything. So all the packages that you had and all the versions and the dependencies are saved together. And then when you reload your program, it loads the entire environment. So nothing changes, because sometimes if you run somebody else's file on your computer, things can break because of what's happening on your machine. So you can containerize it and just load it accordingly. Next, so we looked at having your works, shared your programming tips. Then reports are, of course, an important way you can share your works. So R Markdown or Jupyter notebooks are really helpful for doing that because you can combine the code part as well as the textual information. They're helpful for report writing. So the example we just saw was from a Jupyter notebook. There's again a link over here that talks more about R Markdown and Jupyter notebooks in more detail. Quarto is another great example that I wanted to mention because that's great for collaborating in multiple languages as well. It's an additional environment that comes with RStudio, but it's like a command-like interface, and it helps you create documents. It could be like a Word document, but also something that could be published on the web. And it's helpful for submitting journal articles. And the great thing is that you don't need LaTeX or CSS. So especially like in math and some scientific disciplines, LaTeX is predominantly used, and there's a bit of a learning curve associated with that. So Quarto makes it easier to create those documents. So just wrapping up this section, here's an example that we had created for our institution with the tools that we had. And the idea was, so researchers would reach out to us with what tool can I use to make my work more reproducible and easy to share. So some considerations that we had were, where are they in their research process? Are they just getting started, or are they still doing their research? So if they're in the earlier stages, so they can consider, do they want to pre-register their work, or maybe they're looking for a project management tool for something like that. OSF could be a great option. If they're looking for a collaborative electronic notebook, lab archives could be helpful. There are other ELN softwares like RSpace that could be helpful as well. If they're looking for a space for methods and protocols, they could use protocols.io. So this is early on for ongoing research. If they are done with their research, then there's a question of, are they working with data or are they working with other works? So if it's other works, could just be the articles, it could be methodology or code. So here we mentioned GitLab, which is similar to GitHub, but it's more server-based, and that's available at our university. So you could customize this with what you have as well, or And if they're working with data, so then they can consider, is there a subject-specific repository? So that's one of the first things we like to see. If there is a subject-specific repository, deposit it over there, just because it's best practice and other researchers would be familiar with that. If not, then they can think of other considerations like a data use agreement or large data. Or we have URRR as the name of our institutional repository. So we tell people to deposit work in there as well. So these were some of the examples that talk about tools and reproducibility. Next, we're going to move on to data reproducibility, and I'm going to hand it on to my colleague, Heather.
Hey everyone, thank you very much, Sada, for all your wonderful talk. Now we're going to move on to data reproducibility. So when it comes to data, we really mean more than just data sets. We mean really all the files that are being used as part of your research. And the first thing you want to think about with having reproducible data is having well-organized and managed data and having a README. The README is really the most important thing you can have. We have a funny little tweet on the right. You can have a few hours of trial and error, or you can use a few minutes because you have a README. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, what is a README? Well, a README is a document that should be deposited with all data, should be deposited with your code as well, and the README is usually the first file a reader will visit, and it normally includes a data file overview, sharing access information, methodology, and so on. It is the most important type of documentation you can include. And at the bottom, we have the README template that we use here at our university. So alongside the README, it's also a good idea to have either a codebook or a data dictionary. So a codebook is used to describe the contents and structure of a data collection. So it can be used to describe variables, values, value labels, missing data, and so on. For some research projects, this information is simple enough that it can just be in the README. But if you have a lot of values that you need to describe, you probably should have a separate codebook. Another thing you want to consider is following data standards. So data standards are documented agreements on representation, format, definition, structuring, tagging, transmission, manipulation, use, and management of data. So that's a very long definition, but following data standards means that your data is more interoperable with other people's data, and so it's easier for other people to use. So I have a very basic example here um, where I am following two of the most popular standards. So column B, the country column, I am following the ISO 3166 Alpha 3 standard. So all the countries in the world have a three-letter code. And by following this standard, I'm then able to connect my data with other data sets also following the standard. As we know, there are a lot of countries out there that can be written many different ways. We're from the United States and the USA, the US, the United States, the United States of America. They can be written so many different ways. So following a standard encourages consistency. For the date, I'm following the ISO 8601 standard. So that standard has year first, so YYYY, month, and then day. And this is a really good date standard because when you sort, it will sort in chronological order. And as we know, internationally, in day-to-day life, different countries do write dates differently. So following a standard helps everyone else understand what the date actually is. And you can find a list of standards on fairsharing.org. And one more thing I wanted to mention looking at this data set is I was talking before about having a code book or a data dictionary. And I wanted to show you this example because these column names are meaningless. What does the name mean? What does country mean? Is it the place where the person was born, where they died, where they're currently living? And what does day mean? Like date of what? So I wanted to show the importance of having a code book or data dictionary to describe what these different variables mean. So when you're dealing with data and code and research, you often have a ton of files. And your folder structure really matters because we've all lived in a world where we can't find anything. Well, imagine if you go back to your research 5 years from now, you're not going to know where anything is. Or imagine that you share your data with another researcher. Will they be able to find anything? So it's really important to have a good, clear, understandable folder structure. Your folder structure will vary widely depending on your research, so you don't have to follow this exact structure. But one thing you may notice is at the very top of the folder structure is the README file. You want this to be at the very beginning because, as I said before, one of the things in the README file is the file and data overview. So you can read that README file to know what each of the folders means and where different files are, what folder they are in. So besides just having folders, you have file names. And we've all seen bad file names. This is a very funny example. Project, project 2, project final 2. What's the final project? What's the final version? I don't know. You don't know. Nobody knows. And so to be sure, you'd have to open up each file. So instead, we want convention or an FNC that gives us meaningful file names. So I wanted to show you an example because file naming conventions are hard to understand without an example. And you can use file naming conventions for your research, for your code, for your data, but also for things in your personal life, like, your personal pictures. So I'm going to show you an example using a picture of my dogs. This is Casey. He's going to go with us on this adventure. I think yeah, one more slide. There you go. I think we skipped forward, but we're back to where we're supposed to be. So file naming conventions, there are general rules you want to follow. So first, you want to be consistent. The FNC is only powerful if you always follow it. You want your file name to be as short as possible. It should reserve the 3-letter file extension. You want to avoid using special characters because some softwares can't read it. Similarly, you want to avoid spaces because some software do not recognize them. Use underscores, capital letters, or dashes instead. Avoid generic file names like Project 1. 5 years from now, you're going to have no idea what Project 1 means. And avoid using acronyms as well. With file names, you can also be really smart and think about sorting. This is really important when you have like a ton of research. Like if you are working with a ton of images, like a lot of X-rays, for example, you might have hundreds of images. It's really important to have your files sort correctly. So you want to use the ISO 8601 date format in your file name because then it will sort chronologically. You want to have sorting leading zeros so your numbers sort correctly. So 07 will sort above 70, but 7 will not. So you always want to have those leading zeros. And then you want to consider the hierarchy of terms. This can be hard to understand, but I have an example. And then finally, you always want to include version numbers. So never say final code. Final code 1. Like you should have the name of your code version 01, version 02, and so on. So here we have an example using the YYYYMMDD date format. So on the left, I have the date written in kind of the everyday American style of writing dates. So it's month, day, year. But if you notice, they're not in chronological order. So I have a picture from 2023, then from 2020, then 2021. So nothing's chronological. But on the right side, if I do have it in the year, month, day format, you can see it does sort in chronological order. And here I have an example of thinking of hierarchy of terms or sort order. So talking about my personal pictures, I have two dogs, Casey or Riley. Do I want all my pictures of one dog to be together and then another dog to be together? If that's the case, then the dog name is first. So on the left, you see all my Casey pictures are together and then all my Riley pictures. But if I want everything to sort by date and then to sort by dog, I would have date first and then the name of the dog. So the hierarchy of terms, what's first in your file name, will greatly differ what the sorting will look like. So we're going back to this picture of my dog, and you can see a file naming convention in action. So the file naming convention is date, who, location, version number. And you can see I define what each of these means. And so looking at this file name, I know this picture was taken on February 14th, 2023. It's a picture of Casey at home, and it's the first version, and the file format is a PNG. I don't have to open it. I know what this is a picture of. And a second example, not an excuse to show you my other dog. This is very important to see a second example. But you can see that once again, I know that this picture was taken on April 26, 2023. It's of Riley and Casey, and it's at home. So as you can see, it's very useful. And I wanted to show you an example using personal images because everyone, no matter your profession, can understand that. But file naming conventions can be used in any discipline for any type of file. So Excel data sets, R code, whatever you are using in your research, you have a name for that file. You can use a file naming convention. And so this is a more scientific example with a CSV file, and it's doing research on water samples from two lakes in the area where we live, Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. So you can see that this file naming convention is sample location, date, version number. So because sample location is first, all the data from Lake Ontario will be together, and then all the data on Lake Erie will be together. And maybe you're thinking to yourself, it's too late. I have a million files and they're all badly named. It's too late to fix it. Well, it's never too late to fix your folder and file structure. And these are some free file renaming tools you can use to help you rename files in bulk. So it's never too late. Never give up. So we've talked so far about when it comes to your data, we've talked about having the README, having your standards, having your files and folder structure, but you also want to think about what file formats are you using? And this is really important because who knows what the world will be like 10 years from now? And you want to be able to actually open those files. So you want file formats that are non-proprietary, open, in common usage, they use standard character encodings that are uncompressed. And so on the right are just some examples. These aren't the only preferred formats, but these are some of the more popular ones. And by using these formats, it ensures the longevity of your data. If you're using different file formats, that's okay, but consider making a backup in a preferred format just to help preserve it for the future. And another thing to consider is in your README, we talked about having sharing and access information. So that includes who can use your data and your code and so on. So Sada talked about this earlier, but you want to choose a license for all of your different components. And these are just some of the more popular licenses, and you can learn more about CC licenses on the Creative Commons website. And I'm talking about licensing because now I'm talking about sharing your data. Your data and your code and everything is really only truly reproducible if other people are able to access it and then reproduce it. So how can they access your data? Well, Sada talked a little bit about this before, and she showed you our flowchart we put a lot of effort into making. Hopefully, you thought it was beautiful. Um, but first, you want to share it in a subject or domain-specific repository if that exists. If that doesn't exist, you want to share it in your institutional repository or a generalist repository. And then finally, if you have data that you are particularly concerned about, like human participant data, you may want to share it in a restricted access repository. So what is a subject-specific repository? It's a repository which stores and shares data for a specific subject. However, not all subjects have a subject-specific repository available, and so the disciplines you work with may not have one yet. But keep your eye out. More and more countries around the world are requiring the sharing of data, and so more of these repositories are going to be created. So if you don't have a subject-specific repository, we recommend sharing it in an institutional or generalist repository. So in an institutional repository, all of the data and research in that repository is open to the public. Everyone can access it, but only researchers at the institution can submit there. So you'd want to see if your institution has one. If your institution doesn't, then you just want to share it in a generalist repository. And some popular ones are Harvard Dataverse, Dryad, Figshare, Mendeley Data, OSF, Vivly, and Zenodo. These repositories are part of GRAY, which is a generalist repository ecosystem initiative, and they created a comparison chart so you can easily compare those generalist repositories. So one thing I mentioned is you may not be able to share your data. If you can't share it, then that's fine. It's understandable that sometimes you can't share your data and maybe legally not able to share for copyright reasons, or you may be working with human participants. If that's the case, you want to de-identify your data before you share it. This requires you to remove any personal information from a data set. If de-identifying your data is not enough, you may be able to only share aggregated or summarized data, or you may want to share it in a repository which allows for restricted access. So restricted access means people can only access your data if they sign a data use agreement, sign an application, and get permission to use it. So finally, we are going to talk about your reproducible data summary. So first of all, you want to have a README with all of your other documentation. So your data dictionary, your codebook, your methodology. You want to make sure your data is organized, so you have that folder structure on that file naming convention. And you want to use recommended file types. Make sure your data is clean and analysis ready. So you want to be consistent, you want to follow standards, and in your README, explain your null values and column headings. You want to choose a license for how your data and different components can be used, and then you want to share your data. So in the end, this is our recommended workflow. So that includes both the things Sada was talking about and what I was talking about. So first, you want to pre-register or register your research. Then you want to write your data management plan or your data management and sharing plan and consider storage and preservation. Then you want to write your methods. You may want to consider sharing your methods in protocols IO. You want to come up with your file naming convention and you want to write your README. Then actually do your research using all the reproducible tools and strategies Sada mentioned. Then you want to share your preprints. And then at the very end, when you're sharing that journal article, you want to also make sure you share your data, your code, and your documentation with appropriate licenses. So some final thoughts we have is that you want to use persistent identifiers to link your different components together. So you don't want to share, your data in a repository, and you're coding GitHub, and they're just swimming by themselves, no connection at all. You want everything to be connected together, and you want them all to have a DOI. It's also really good to have that ORCID for yourself. So that is the identifier for the researcher. And you want to link to all of your articles, code, data, and methods in your ORCID. Remember, your research is only truly reproducible if a stranger unfamiliar with your data and process can replicate your results. If they can't do it, then your work is not really reproducible. And finally, open science is the future, and it's being increasingly required by both journals and funders. Reproducibility is an essential part of open science, so think about it now. Don't wait until the future when you suddenly have to start working on it. Do it now. And this is us in our emails. We have time now for Q&A, but also feel free to email either one of us with any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Heather, for such a thought-provoking discussion. Thank you, Sarah. So I could not get an opportunity to introduce Heather, but she is a data librarian in the same University of Rochester, where she reviews data management and sharing plans, consults on data management and sharing best practices, and teaches data workshops. She has an MS in Library Information Science and a certificate in Advanced Studies in Data Science from Syracuse University, and a BA in Mathematics and English Literature from the University of Rochester. So I think if you allow me, both the speakers, can you please use your videos now and audios as well? And can we take up a couple of questions? Sarah, already there are a couple of questions if you may like to
Yes.
answer. There is one question from Justin, and he is asking, are there any resources to help make sure your data is clean and organized before submitting it to a repository? So if you can see the answered part.
Okay. So we could both talk about this. Heather, I can let you jump as well. So some of it is looking at best practices that you have. So we talked about some of the things, having a checklist. So if you have a README for one instance, and that is helpful. And what you want to do is think of your work from a perspective of someone who's not familiar. So I think, this is one place where talking to a friend might be helpful too. Show them a sample of your data and just your project and what you're planning to submit to a repository. You can also reach out to experts like data librarians at your institution if you have them, and just ask them if this makes sense. I think this is one place where having a second set of eyes is also useful. Or you could talk to your students. So is there something missing over here? And maybe, if you have a bunch of things, try to run it on a different machine as well. So, generally we have things on our computer and it's all saved with all the dependencies. Try it on a different machine, and then if you get an error, that would tell you where you can go back and fix things.
Right. So can I go for next question? Few
Sure.
of the question. So there is a question from Prakash. Can you please suggest any DMP tool for data management?
I better take that.
Data management is kind of broad. There's really not one tool that will do the entire data management process for you. So I guess I can talk about different tools you can use throughout the process. So a popular tool to help you write a data management and sharing plan is the DMP tool. So that can help you write your data management and sharing plan. Then if you want a tool to help you during your research process, having an electronic laboratory notebook can help keep all your files and data organized. It's a really great collaborative tool. There are different types of electronic laboratory notebooks out there. Within our institution, we use lab archives. So that can help with managing your data and your research. So if you're like concerned about like how to manage your data during the research project, if that's what you're asking with this question, I would look into an electronic laboratory notebook. If you're more of a social science researcher, then maybe using OSF would be better suited towards your purpose, although you can use an electronic laboratory notebook no matter what your discipline is. Um, Hopefully that is helpful to you. If that's what your question was, how do you manage your data during the research process? In the end, there is no one magical tool that will do it for you, but there are tools that can help you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Heather, for great explanation. So there is another question, how to share anonymity of human participant data while ensuring data sharing and reproducible way of workflow. If you like can see in the
Yes,
third
I
part.
see. Yes, so human participant data does indeed have to be shared carefully. Um, And one thing to keep in mind is that if you are being required to share your data by a funder or a publisher, they do understand that that's a real legitimate reason why you may not be able to share it. And so there are many different ways that you can um, safely share your data. And the first thing you want to do is you want to de-identify your data. And de-identification is the process of removing any identifiers about the human participants. Now, de-identification differs in how successful it can be. For example, if you are studying a really rare illness in a small community, there's not going to be that many people with that illness. Therefore, you could never successfully de-identify your data. It's just not possible. So when you're doing work with human participants and you're thinking about de-identifying your data, you have to decide, can it be safely de-identified? If it cannot be safely de-identified, this doesn't mean that you just share nothing. You can share aggregated data. So this is like a summary of your data. So you're not having your raw data on each individual human participant. It's aggregated. You can also share your data in a restricted access repository. And so this means that there's a record of your data existing publicly, but people cannot access it. And in order to access it, it has to be another researcher. They have to go through quite a lengthy process. They have to write an application. They have to sign a data use agreement. A data use agreement basically means that the researcher can only use the data in the way you describe it can be used. They cannot share it either. And then once this is signed and everything, and they will be given the data and only that research team. So just there are ways that other people can reproduce your work, even if you are working with human participants, but there are definitely different things you have to be concerned about. Um, I just talked a lot. Hopefully that answered your question. Let me know if you want any more additional information about that.
So there is a I mean, like explanation in one of the that a standard spreadsheet can be used that is applicable, convenient, and adopted by all countries. I don't know. I mean, what is your thoughts on it, Sarah or Heather? Can we have such an standard, or do we have any such standard that can be used, or maybe applicable, or maybe adopted by all countries?
By
Um,
standard spreadsheet, do you mean a standard or do you mean a software? Because I see another question about sustainable data management, or if that's what they're getting at.
Uh, I don't know because that is the only like text that has been posted here in Q&A.
If they're thinking of spreadsheet specifically, then something like a CSV format is typically
mhm.
that's something that would work with a lot of things. And that's why we would say don't use Excel. Like people think everybody has Excel, but it is a proprietary software at the end of the day. Instead of that, with Excel as well, when you're saving your files, instead of saving it as a .xlsx, you can save it as a .csv, and that would work with a lot more software. So that is one thing for spreadsheets that you could do. And for other things with standards, it is tricky to find things that work across countries. One thing that seems to work better is standards across disciplines. Even that is something that people are working on, but some disciplines are more ahead of the game, where there's like earth sciences is a great example, where earth and environmental sciences, they have a lot of documentation and recommendations out there for how they want to do their data management and data processing. So that's one way to tackle it.
Right. So there is a like question from Vinod Mishra, who is again from the centrally funded technical institution system. Which software may be more sustainable for data management or analysis like R, Python, etc., as technology frequently becomes obsolete?
So one thing here, and Heather, you can add to this as well. So with R and Python, so yeah, there's definitely things with versions that come up, and people can keep track of that. So there are softwares that can help you with version control, but in general, open source software are an easier idea, because if it's something proprietary, say, that might be something where it can get obsolete, but the other problem is you might just lose access to this. To the software, or there could be other payment issues. But if it's open source, and there's generally a big community of people who are supporting it, so R and Python are both open source languages. So the hope is that someone out there would care enough to at least continue it in the long term, or maybe help find an alternative. There's a big community with Stack Overflow online, and if you have a question with R or Python, who are ready to help you as well.
Yeah.
Right. So, Sarah, if you can read the question from Muhammad Moinur Islam Insari, it is a long question. There is a saying that in the 21st century, data is the new oil. To convert a messy data to a tiny data or filter data, is there any open source data analysis software or tool? Because we Librarian has essential part in the sharing knowledge, we promote open source. How is Open Refine fit in this category also?
First thing, I think I just want to say Sada and I are big Open Refine fans. We teach Open Refine workshops as well. I'm gonna let Sada answer this question
Yeah.
because it's more coding based, but I just want to say we are big fans of Open Refine. It's a
It's
great
funny.
open.
I was going to say that first as well. I was exactly, my first thing was Heather and I are both big fans of Open Refine. It's a great software for cleaning your data. It makes it so much easier. But again, like I was saying, R and Python are both open source software as well. So if you're using one of those things, it's because cleaning your data is a part of your analysis. I mean, there have been studies that say that sometimes if you're analyzing your data, 70% of your work is going to be cleaning it, and then you get to the analysis stage in general. So if you're using an open source software, the recommendation is to keep track of the steps that you're doing. If you're cleaning things, if you're making changes to your data, have your raw data unchanged and saved separately. And then any of the cleaning and the modification that you do, that can be done separately, and then use an open source software. And Open Refine is just great because it makes it easier, and it's less coding based as well. So, and again, something open source.
Thank you very much. We will take two quick questions in the interest of time, because it is too late for you, close to like 12 night. So there is a do the researcher need to cite data which is used from GitHub? This is from Gopala Krishnan. Do the researcher need to cite data which is used from GitHub?
Researchers in general, data should be cited. And when you have your license that you put on your data, that does control how your data can be used. But it's really, of course, there is no citation police. But it's general best practice, yes, for data and code and everything to be cited. And you can put different licenses on your data to control that. It's the best that can be done. And people are generally good at citing data.
Thank you very much. There are still many questions, but I think there should be, like, we have to take care of your time as well. So I'm grateful to both of you for agreeing to our request from engineering community, delivering a great session. And you can still see there are 309 people who have still hang on. And I think 200 unique people joined this session, although it was little bit technical for a librarian who is providing traditional services. But I think the way you people explained, it will help them to it will generate interest in them to explore these ways of delivering great service and for user engagement. I would now like to invite my colleague Dr. Manu TR from IIT Delhi to sum up and formally thank both of you and the attendees for joining this morning and this late evening. Over to
Thank you,
you,
sir.
Dr. Manu.
Thank you, sir. It's been a wonderful webinar. Without taking much time, we already passed the 2 minutes late what we have scheduled this session. It's been a what we have working in the Indian context. I think this is related to the what we have been saying, that research data management, and open science. Somehow this is a related topic for us to know how we're going to manage the data from the right beginning to the at the end of the research. Every elements of research life cycle has some of the things to be managed and make it to the reproducibility. That's how we are starting from the workflow. What you have seen, that the whatever the piece of data we're going to generate, how we're going to save in terms of the making the file, naming the file sequence, how we're going to create the DMP. I think that the webinar what we have, I would like to see that in Indian country it's required, and the excellent speakers have been covered all the aspects of reproducibility of the data and aspects. And from on behalf of myself, on behalf of my institutions, Institute of Technology, I just thank you both the speakers, and especially the attendees who have been joined from the all over India and out of the other countries also. I would like to thank all the attendees for sparing their valuable time and giving the questions. I have been looking the questions. It's been an interesting topic, and we are also looking the such webinars in the future also. Yeah, thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Heather. And for participant, we will be sharing the recording on your registered email, and those interested, they will be getting the digital certificates as well on their registered email. Thank you very much. And I think this is just a beginning, and we will be continuing our association for professional reasons in the coming times as well. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.